Good evening, ladies as well as gentlemen. My name is Papa Boris, and in this video I'm going to teach you how to play the Pathfinder adventure card game. If you're not familiar with this game, here's a 10-second explanation. It's kind of like Dungeons & Dragons reimagined as a cooperative deck-building card game. In particular, this game is really great if you want to play Dungeons & Dragons, but you can't because everybody's all grown up. You got your spouses, you got your children, nobody wants to spend 8 hours a week being the dungeon master, and even if somebody did, not everybody can come to every game. If your cleric doesn't show up, it's a goddamn disaster. So this game allows you to scratch all the same itches as Dungeons & Dragons. Everybody starts with a character at level 1, you level up, you kill things, take their loot, get stronger, get feats, customize your character how you like, all that good stuff. But if somebody can't make it to a session, no big deal. The scale's up and down from 1 to 6 with no problem. Nobody has to be the DM. As long as everybody helps shuffle a few decks at the beginning, you're all set up and you're ready to go. My teaching assistant in this game is the digital version of this game, which was released yesterday. Or if you're watching this 1 year in the future, it's available on Steam. For now, it's available only on tablets, iOS and Android. So if you are playing this on Steam, curse you, person from the future, I'm so jealous. But anyway, for now, tablets are fine. Normally, I don't talk too much about my teaching assistants or my instructive aids, whatever you want to call it for my explanation videos, but I have to give a plug. This digital version is freaking amazing. It's incredible, especially if you want to play solo. It is free to play. You can try 2 of the characters, Mauricio the Rogue and Kira the Cleric, entirely for free, and 3 of the scenarios that come with the game are totally free in the digital version. So just go try it out, and then please pay Obsidian $25 so that they can continue making the Pathfinder adventure card game for tablets and later on Steam. So let's go ahead and explain how this works. You can play a party up to 4 characters with the base set, and there are 7 characters to choose from. If you get the character add-on pack, this adds 4 more characters to the game for a total of 11 to choose from, and you can play up to 6 players at a time. When you pick a character, the defining features of a character are their skills, their powers, and their cards list. So let's go ahead and talk about each of these things in turn, beginning with skills. We're going to use as our example here Mauricio the Rogue, because she's one of the 2 characters who is free in the digital version of the game. So there are 6 skills in this game, 6 core skills, and if you've ever played Dungeons & Dragons or any of the BioWare games, these will look instantly familiar to you. Strength on down through charisma. And each skill has a D next to it, as well as a number. Again, this is either incredibly familiar to you, or if it's not, it's like arcane incomprehensible bullshit. So let me just take a moment to explain this. The D means die, and the 8 is the number of sides on the die. So typically when normal people say the word die or dice, they're talking about D6s. These are 6-sided dice, cubes basically, with the numbers 1 through 6 written on them. But in Dungeons & Dragons, you use all kinds of dice. As small as a D4 with 4 sides, and as big as a D12 with 12 dice. With 12 sides. Each die determines how good your character is at certain things, and it makes sense. So like Mauricio's a rogue, she's extremely dexterous. She's as dexterous as you can get. However, she's pretty dumb, and average at most things, except for strength, she's quite strong. So that's how you can read these. Whenever you encounter, challenges in the game, the challenge will tell you what check you have to hit and what skill you're using for the check. So for example, there might be, let's say, a dexterity 8 check that is needed in order to get away from a certain barrier. So if Mauricio encountered that, she'd roll a d12, a 12-sided die, because that's what her dexterity is. Kira the Cleric, blundering around in her armor, is not particularly nimble, so if she were making that check, she'd only roll a d4. This does mean it's sometimes possible to encounter things that you literally cannot succeed at. All the characters have at least 2 specialized skills. For example, our rogue here knows acrobatics, disable, stealth, and perception. These are skills that your character is extra good at, so if they have to make a check for one of those, they get a bonus. For example, Mauricio is really good at acrobatics. If she has to make an acrobatics check in this game, she actually rolls her dexterity die, which is a d12, and then adds 2. So if she were attempting an acrobatics check, she'd roll a 12-sided die and add 2 to the result as her final value for the check. In this game, if you achieve or exceed the value of a check, then you succeed. So for example, if Mauricio is trying a dexterity 6 check, as long as she rolls a 6 or higher on the d12, she succeeds. If she rolls a 5 or below, she fails. If she's trying an acrobatics 6 check, she only needs to roll a 4 or higher on the d12 because of course 4 plus 2 is 6, and that would allow her to succeed. So these are the character's skills. Now there's lots of skills in the game, and of course no character has all the skills. Like for example, Kira here, she's a cleric, so she has divine and fortitude and melee. Mariziel doesn't know any of these skills. So typically in this game you'll have a choice. Like it'll say, make a fortitude or constitution check. So, Kira, if she were making that check, she'd roll her constitution and add 3 to the result, because she has the fortitude skill. Mariziel, however, does not have the fortitude skill, so she would just roll her constitution die, without any extra bonuses. If you do have to make a check for a skill that you don't know, you always roll a d4 without any bonuses. So that's how skills work. Next, let's take a look at powers. Powers are my favorite part because these identify the ways in which your character is special and different from all the other characters. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit here. Mariziel has 2 powers, hide and sneak attack. Hide allows her to evade her encounter. Don't have to pay anything, don't have to do anything, just boom. You don't like what you came up with, you can run away from it. So she's a rogue, she gets to do that. Sneak attack makes her better at combat. As long as she is alone at a location, she can recharge a card to give an extra 6-sided die to her combat check, or she can discard it to actually give her a total of 2d6 to her combat check. Now this game, as you might be starting to notice, has a lot of jargon. I'm not going to explain all the terms in one list because that'd be boring, but we will explain some of these keywords as they come along. So recharge means to put a card on the bottom of your deck. Discard means to put the card in your discard pile. In this game, unlike in other deck building games, when you run out of cards in your deck, you do not automatically shuffle your discard pile into your deck. In this game, if there are no cards in your deck and you need to draw a card, you die. So your deck is kind of also like your hit points. So Mariziel has a choice. She can recharge a card, put it at the bottom of her deck, and get 1d6, which doesn't cost her any permanent resources. Or if she really needs to go balls out, she can discard the card for a total of 2d6, but then the card goes into her discard pile and then it is lost semi-permanently. Every character, in addition to their powers, also has some standard things in their power section. The power section is where you go to learn about your character's hand size. So Mariziel at the start of the game draws up to 5 cards, and she also draws or discards down to 5 cards at the end of her turn. And then there's also a proficiency tab. So there's 3 different proficiencies in this game. There is light armor, heavy armor, and weapons. Mariziel has light armor proficiency, and she doesn't have weapon proficiency, but she could get it later via a power feat. That's what this open checkbox means. If she acquires a power feat at some point in her adventuring, she may choose to spend it here to become proficient with weapons. Looking at Kira, she actually has light armor and heavy armor proficiency. Like Mariziel, Kira does not have weapon proficiency, but she could get it later on via a power feat. You might notice that where Kira starts with light armor and heavy armor proficiency, Mariziel not only doesn't have heavy armor proficiency, but she can never get it. Even with a power feat, she can never become proficient with heavy armors, because again, she's a rogue. So it's all pretty thematic and sensible here. Casters tend to have really big hand sizes. Warriors tend to have low hand sizes, and then you got characters like the rogue and the cleric who are sort of in between and have a hand size of 5. Okay, so that's the powers. Now let's take a look at the cards. So at the beginning of the game, each character starts with a deck of 15 cards, and you can get up to more than 15 cards at the end of any given scenario. But you must always start each scenario with 15 cards. So if you end with more, you basically have to throw some cards away. If you end with less, you have to pick some cards back up. And the cards list tells you what the distribution of cards is in your deck. This is what makes every character different, or one of the things. So Mariziel, for example, being a rogue, she's got a couple of weapons. She doesn't know any spells. She's got 1 armor. She likes gadgets and things, so she has a butt ton of items. Then a couple of allies and blessings to round things out. You might notice Kira here has a couple of weapons and a couple of armors. So she's like an armored cleric type deal. She's also got 3 spells. But she's not so hot on items and allies, and because she, of course, is a godful character, she has a lot of blessings, more than Mariziel does. So, at the beginning of the game, when you first create your character, you actually have a lot of options for how to create your deck. As long as you adhere to these requirements, you can pick any cards that you want, as long as they have the basic trait. Then, as you can imagine, as you play the game and go along, you will get better cards. So you'll start to find weapons that are better than the basic ones you start with. items that are cooler than the basic ones that you started with, and so on. So that's one of the ways that you progress in this game, is by finding better cards. The other way that you progress through the game is by getting power feats, card feats, and skill feats, basically by getting feats. When you beat certain scenarios, you'll get a skill, power, or card feat as a reward. You don't always get a feat as a reward, by the way, but when you do, it'll specify which type it is. So when you get a card feat, you basically get to add an extra card to your deck, and you get to choose which one. So for example, if Kira were to get a card feat and put it into allies, she'd now have 2 allies in her deck rather than just 1. She'd also have an extra card overall, and because cards in your deck are kind of like hit points in this game, she would become an overall sturdier character, regardless of which type of card she chose. There are limits, of course, so once Kira puts a card feat into ally, she cannot do that anymore. So characters are always constrained in what they can choose for their card feats. The rogue could actually learn a spell if she wanted to, but 1 spell is all she's ever going to have, and you get the idea. That's how the card feats work. Power feats we kind of saw before. You can use them to increase your hand size or get proficiency, or you can use them to make your abilities better. So for example, Moriziel could get improved sneak attack, which would allow her to recharge a card to add a d6 plus 1 to her combat check, as opposed to just a regular d6. And you can imagine she can get friggin' fantastic sneak attack, which will give her a d6 plus 2 bonus to her combat check for recharging a card. Finally, we have the skill feats. So skill feats are actually some of the strongest feats, even though I talked about them last. These are sort of limited like card feats. You can't just put as many as you want into everything. There's a limit to how far you can go for each skill. And what they do is they basically just give a +1 bonus to every roll that you make with that skill for the rest of your character's life. So if Moriziel puts a +1 into dexterity, then anytime she rolls a dexterity check, an acrobatics check, a disable check, or a stealth check, she adds an additional +1 to her result. And then eventually that can get up to +4, which is, obviously a pretty big deal. Okay, that's enough of the characters. Let's go ahead and make our party. I'm going to use, for our party, the rogue and the cleric, because those are the 2 characters that are free with the digital version of the game. Just to show you that, you're not, like, being janked. These are solid characters, and you can have a good time with this 2-character party. And we'll go ahead now and create our initial decks. I'm not going to talk about this too much here, just because I really am more concerned about explaining the rules, but along the way, you'll see some of the decisions that you can make. So I'm going to go ahead and start with our rogue, and we're going to choose her weapons. This is going to be a good chance to explain how weapons work. Please note, as always, I'm not necessarily making optimal decisions for these characters. I'm just making some choices to show you how stuff works. Let's give Moriziel a light crossbow. So this crossbow says, for your combat check, reveal this card to use your dexterity or range skill plus a d8. Here we have another keyword, reveal. Reveal means you show the card, but it actually stays in your hand, which, for weapons, makes sense, right? Why am I chucking my crossbow away every time I fire a bolt? You do not need to worry about ammunition in this game for ranged weapons. Now, that means that when Moriziel encounters a monster and makes a combat check, she will show this crossbow, if it's in her hand, roll her dexterity die, which is a d12, and also a d8. So she'll be rolling a d12 and a d8 against the monster's check. She can then also, if she is alone at the location, recharge or discard a card for extra sneak attack dice. Note that Moriziel does not have the ranged skill, which is why she's using dexterity instead. Then there's some more text in this crossbow, but because Moriziel is not proficient with weapons, she cannot avail herself of that text. Let's just keep things simple here and give her a couple of crossbows. Kira is a melee character, so we're going to give her some melee weapons. Let's take a look at a longsword. Longsword says, for your combat check, reveal this card and use your strength or melee skill plus a d8. Kira does have the melee skill, by the by. I'll show you here. It is melee strength plus 2, so she rolls a d6 and adds 2 for her melee checks. So she actually can do that. She does not have to roll her raw strength die. She can use her melee skill. Then you add a d8, so she'll be rolling a d6 plus a d8 plus 2, and you may additionally discard this card to add another d6. So if you really want to go balls to the walls Dickens on a monster and you don't mind losing your longsword, you can get your melee skill, a d8, and a d6 on the check. But look at this line. If not proficient with weapons, the difficulty of this check is increased by 4. Oh no, that's bad. I don't want a harder check. I want easier checks. So because Kira does not start with weapon proficiency, she probably doesn't want to put a longsword into her deck. I'm thinking we're going to give her a couple of maces. Maces are similar to longswords. Yeah, when you discard it, you get only a d4 bonus, not a d6 bonus, but it doesn't have that extra line at the end. These weapons don't require proficiency, so they're a better fit for our cleric. I'm going to talk about spells later because they're kind of complicated. Let's jump to armors. So armors in this game are pretty simple. Let's take a look at chainmail here, the basic armor. You can recharge them, meaning put them on the bottom of your deck, to reduce incoming combat damage by a certain amount, so in this case it's by 2, or you can banish the card to reduce all damage dealt to you to 0. So banish in this game is the highest price you could ever pay. That means you actually lose the card completely permanently, and it goes back into the game box. This allows you, though, to have a very strong effect. You can reduce all incoming damage dealt to you to 0. Notice up here, it's only combat damage that you can reduce, but for this effect, it's any kind of damage. Fire damage, dragon breathes 100 billion fire damage on you, no problem. I've got chainmail, that'll save me completely. And what's really cool is that if you're proficient with heavy armors, you don't banish the card, you actually bury it. So bury it is another keyword. Burying in the physical game is kind of like you put the card under your character sheet. So things that can let you get discarded cards back into your deck don't work on buried cards. In fact, there's like literally like one way you can ever get a buried card back into your deck. So buried cards are pretty really permanently lost, but at the end of the scenario, you can put them back into your deck. Unlike banished cards, which instead of going under your character sheet, go all the way back into the game box. So Kira can bury this chainmail if she takes a butt ton of damage to reduce all the damage to 0. There are also shields. Shields fucking suck, so we're not going to take a shield, we're just going to take chainmail. Mariziel is proficient with light armor, not with heavy armor, so we'll give her some leather armor. Notice leather armor doesn't reduce incoming damage by as much with the recharge, but it still has this thing of, being able to bury or banish it to reduce all incoming damage to 0, so that's nice to have. Items, frankly, I'm not going to spend too much time on items, but items just have a variety of effects. Potion of Glibness, you can banish it, meaning permanently lose it, to automatically succeed at a diplomacy check. Caltrops, you can banish it to kill an easy monster or to run away from a slightly harder monster. We're not going to go ahead and discuss items too much, and I'm just going to keep the character's default items for the purpose of this video. But suffice it to say, as you can see, there's a lot of different items that you can choose from in this game, so you have quite a lot of customization options, even for a level 1 character. Similarly for allies, I'm not going to go ahead and talk about them too much. We're not going to change them up much. But allies oftentimes have this. Discard this card to explore your location, which right now you have no idea what that means, so I'm not going to talk about it much, alongside some other way that they could possibly be used. So again, we're going to leave the allies alone. And blessings, you don't have a choice. All the basic blessings are a blessing of the gods, so that's what everybody starts with for their blessings. So before we start playing the game and explaining how the rules actually work, we do need to talk about spells. So Kira's got some spells. Let's take a look. Spells are these purple cards, and they start out very similar to other types of cards. They just have text and an effect. So for Cure, you reveal it, choose a character, and shuffle 1d4 plus 1 random cards from that character's discard pile into the character's deck. Then the Cure is discarded. So basically, Kira can pick herself, or Mariziel, if Mariziel's at her location, roll a 4-sided die, add 1, and that many cards get shuffled from the character's discard pile into their deck. So this is how healing works in this game. Remember, if your deck runs out and you have to draw a card, you die. So getting cards from your discard pile shuffled back into your deck is kind of like healing. Here's where spells get different from other cards. Most cards just tell you, do this, you get that. But spells have some special rules. So whenever you play a spell, if you don't have the requisite skill, so for Cure it's Divine, the card is actually banished, meaning it's permanently lost. So basically, any character in the game can essentially treat a spell card as if it were a scroll and get a one-time use of the spell. However, characters who do have the requisite skill get to keep the spell, and they even get a chance to recharge it instead of discarding it. So if Kira makes a Divine 8 check, she actually puts the Cure on the bottom of her deck. Otherwise, she discards the spell. So let me just be very clear about this. We'll take a look at Kira's character sheet just a moment. Check it out. Her Divine skill is Wisdom plus 2. So after she casts that Cure, she's going to roll a d12, add 2. If the result is 8 or higher, she gets to put her Cure on the bottom of her deck. Sweet. But if she flubs it and rolls like a 2, then the Cure goes into her discard pile. And although there are a few exceptions, just about all spells work this way. You either banish it if you don't have the requisite skill, Divine or Arcane, or if you do have the requisite skill, you actually get a shot at recharging the card instead of discarding it. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this crap, and I'm going to give her a couple of inflicts. These are combat spells. So for your combat check, discard this to use your Divine skill plus a d6, and you, again, if you don't have the Divine skill, then you banish the card. Otherwise, you discard it unless you make a Divine 6 check, in which case you actually get to recharge it. So we're going to put these inflicts here into her deck to give her a little bit of extra firepower. Okay, so now we got to actually explain how the game works. We've created our decks. Let's party. This game is really kind of like a D&D campaign. You're going to play a series of scenarios. In Rise of the Rune Lords, there are 33 scenarios. 3 of them serve as a kind of prologue. And then there are 6 chapters, each with 5 scenarios. 5 times 6 is 30, plus 3 is 33. We're going to start with the very first scenario of the prologue, because we have to. It's called Brigand Doom. In the physical game, you're going to have a card for the scenario, which tells you what villain to include in that scenario, what henchman to include in that scenario, and what special rules, if any, are present in that scenario. You'll also see what the reward is for beating the scenario. So if Kira and Mariziel successfully face down the challenges of Brigand Doom, they will get a random item from the box. Spoiler alert, it's kind of a shitty reward, but hey, it's the first scenario. And if they manage to beat the whole adventure, which in this case means if they manage to beat all 3 of these prologue scenarios, they get a skill feat as a reward, which is pretty sweet since, you know, extra skill feats make characters much stronger. Now let's go ahead and start the scenario. I will explain, even though this is the digital version, how to set it up in the physical game. Of course, the digital game takes care of all the setup for you, but for those of you thinking about getting the physical copy, let me explain how you set this up. The scenario, let me just skip the preview here if you don't mind. The scenario will tell you what locations to use and how many locations to use. Typically, the number of locations in each scenario is the number of players plus 2. So because I'm playing a 2-player game here, I will have 2 plus 2, which is 4 locations. If I were playing with 6 characters, I would have 8 locations. You get the idea. The card will tell you for the scenario what locations to use. So, for example, if you were looking at the physical game, for Brigand Doom, it would tell you that for a 2-player game, you would use the farmhouse, the woods, the waterfront, and the wooden bridge. So these are the location cards that you'd set out. Let's go ahead and take a look at one of these locations. We'll try the wooden bridge. So each location has a card in the game has some important information. So first of all, it's got an at this location thing, which tells you what you can do when you're at that location that's maybe special from other locations. The wooden bridge's special ability is that you can discard 2 cards to evade your encounter. Each location has a closing requirement, which we'll talk about later what that means, and a when permanently closed thing, which again, I'll talk about that later, but suffice it to say that when the location closes, if you're there, then you may get some kind of special effect. Some locations, like the woods, don't have any permanently closed effects here, so you should check your cards carefully to see if there's anything you need to worry about or not. Each location card also tells you how to set it up. So there will always be 10 cards in a location at the start of the game. 9 of them are printed on the card, like the wooden bridge has, and you'll see what these icons mean as I go through them. 3 monsters, 1 barrier, no weapons, no spells, 1 armor, no items, 3 allies. Man, there's a lot of people hanging out on the wooden bridge. Wooden bridge is the place to be. 1 blessing, and then 1 mystery card. We'll talk about that in a moment. But these first ones always add up to 9. So there will be like a different distribution at different locations. The woods, for example, is dark and very scary. 4 monsters, wow. 2 barriers, a weapon, a couple of items. You add this all up, you get up to 9. So there's always 9 cards in the location. What's the 10th card, you might ask? Well, at the beginning of the game, the scenario card will tell you who the villain is and who the henchmen are. Your objective, which I guess I could have mentioned earlier, is to defeat the villain. That's what you're trying to do. That's how you win the scenario, is by defeating the villain. So what you do is you take the villain and shuffle him up with the henchmen. Then you randomly deal one of those cards to each of the 4 locations. Let me give you the bottom line of that. What that means is that each location has a 1 in 4 chance that the villain is in there, and a 3 in 4 chance that one of the villain's henchmen is in there. So basically, if we go back to the wooden bridge, this question mark card has a 3/4 chance of being a bandit and a 1 in 4 chance of being the villain. Needless to say, once you finish all the setting up, you shuffle each location deck and then you can start the game. So, we'll explain how the villain and the henchman work later on. Obviously, I cannot choose how things work in the digital version, so we might have to go through a number of cards before we find the villain and or the henchman. But let's just go ahead and explain how you start playing one of these scenarios. So the first thing that you do is you decide where each character starts. I'm going to go ahead and put Mariziel at the bridge, and I'm going to put Kira in the woods for reasons that I'll explain later on. Then each character, excuse me, then you can choose the turn order, and then each character will draw up to their opening hand size. So for both of these characters, it's 5, but some characters will be 4 and some characters will be 6. So once you draw your hand, I want to mention a quick thing. In the physical game, you have to make sure that at least one card of the character's favored card type is in the hand. Let me show you that real quick. This is in the cards list. It'll say on the cards, on your character's card sheet, what their favorite card type is. So for Maurizio, it's items, and for Kira, it's blessings. So basically, you have, I won't get into it, but the rulebook will tell you, you have to follow a sequence of steps just to make sure that your character has at least one card of that type in their opening hand. Otherwise, you discard the hand, draw a new hand, and keep doing that until you have at least one card of that type. Okay, so now both characters have a hand of stuff, and we can start playing. Let me explain the sequence of events in a turn. The first thing that you can do on your turn is give somebody a card. So you can actually see these buttons, they list the sequences, or the sequence of steps for the turn. The person you give a card to needs to be at your location. Because I put Maurizio and Kira at different locations, this action's not available. Since there is no location, there's no one else at the location that Maurizio is at. You will not be using this give a card action very much, but of course it does have some tactical and strategic uses that you can uncover as you get better at the game. Then you may move. Movement in this game is pretty freeform. You can move to any location that you want to. So right now I can move to the waterfront if I want. I can join Kira in the woods. I can go to the farmhouse. Movement in this game is pretty lax. Or I can just choose to stay right here because that's where I wanted to go in the first place. After you move, you can explore, and this is really the key action of the game. Exploring means you look at the top card of the location deck and you interact with it. You do stuff with it. So in this game, there are monsters and barriers. These are bad things. They're called banes. Everything else, your 6 fundamental card types, weapons, spells, armors, items, allies, and blessings, those are good things. Those are called boons. So what happens after you explore is different depending on whether you find a bane or a boon. Let's go ahead and see what's waiting for us in the wooden bridge. It's a bandit henchman! Alright, this is actually fantastic because this means, oh my god, oh no, don't do this to me, air server. Air server, hello? Oh my god. Alright, well, okay, we'll be back in a second, everybody. Okay, that was obnoxious, but we're back. We're back. Okay, so we had just happened to encounter the henchman as our very first exploration at the location, which is fantastic because it makes my job of teaching you the rules a whole lot easier. So the bandit is a monster. And so basically everything that I explain about the bandit is going to be true for monsters in general. So the monster in the upper right-hand corner will have a check to defeat. In this case, it's a combat 8. Most, but not all, monsters will have a combat check to defeat them, although there are, of course, exceptions. So this one's a normal monster, though it's a combat 8. Barriers might also have, monsters might also have some texts. So this bandit gets harder the further in the game you are. And before you act, you have to recharge a card. So what we're going to do here is we're going to have to follow that text because we need to recharge one of our cards. Maurizio has a potion of vision, which I'm not super jazzed about, so we're just going to go ahead and recharge it. Now, this scenario, because it's the first scenario of the game, has a special rule, which is that whenever a monster makes you recharge a card, you draw a replacement. So that's actually not too big of a deal that we're recharging that potion of vision. We got a new card now. Sweet, this burglar has entered our hand. Now we have to make a combat check. So let's do this, all right? I'm going to go ahead and reveal my light crossbow. So now I'm rolling a d12, which, again, light crossbow says for your combat check, reveal it. Use your dexterity die. Maurizio's dexterity is a d12 plus a d8. So you can see I've got a d12 and a d8 ready to be rolled. I really want to kill this bandit, though. I definitely don't want to fail. So I'm going to go ahead and fire up sneak attack. And I have a choice to either discard or recharge a card. I really want this bandit to die. I don't want to take any chances. So we're going to go ahead and discard the burglar for an extra 2d6. At this point, I should probably explain how blessings work. So blessings, this is the basic blessing, can be discarded to add a die to any check. So I can discard this Blessing of the Gods to get a d12. You can also discard them to explore your location. So normally you only get to explore once in a turn. You may want to explore more than once per turn, though, and you can discard blessings to get those extra explorations. I'll explain why you might want to do that later on. It's interesting to note that blessings can be played on any check. So Kira, even though she's not at the location and she's not the one engaged in this combat, she can actually discard this blessing to give Mauricio an extra die, and then Mauricio would roll an extra d12. A quick note here, when it says discard this card to add 1 die, the die that you add is whatever the skill is that determined the check. So the skill that determined the check here was dexterity, so that's why we would add a dexterity. If Kira were making a combat check using her melee skill and somebody played a blessing on her, that would only add a d6, because then the die that was determining her check type was a d6, not a d12. So that's an extra little bonus for being a character with high stats. Okay, I'm going to roll the dice, and I really hope this doesn't fail, because that'd be awkward. Hooray! We successfully killed the bandit. Okay. When you kill a monster, normally that's it. Henchmen are just like monsters with one special rule, which is that when you kill a henchman, you have the opportunity to close a location. So we're going to have to talk for a little bit here about what the hell exactly that means. Closing a location, if you successfully pull it off, takes out all of the cards in that location and puts them back in the box. The only exception is if a villain happens to be in the location, then basically what would happen is you take all the cards out of the location, put them back in the box, and you leave the villain as the only card left in the location. Right now, there's a 0% chance of the villain being in this location because, of course, each location has either one henchman or one villain. At the start of the game, you can't have more than one in the same location. When you defeat a villain, the villain runs. So remember I said the objective of the game is to defeat the villain. The villain is just like a regular monster, with one difference, which is that when you defeat the villain, he runs away to an open location. This is why it's useful to close locations. If all the locations are closed, except for the one where you're fighting the villain, and then you kill the villain, then you win. So that's what you're trying to do. You're going around trying to find the henchman so you can close the location so that when you find the villain, you can corner him, he dies, and you win. If you do find the villain early, like let's say that card had been the villain instead of a henchman, then the villain runs away to another location, and the location closes automatically. If you kill a henchman, the location does not close automatically. You have to succeed at a check to close it. And that's why I put Mauricio on the bridge. See, this location closes if you succeed at a dexterity or stealth 6 check. It just so happens Mauricio is pretty damn good at stealth. Her stealth is a dexterity +2, which is a d12 +2. Now, I don't want to take any chances. I mean, I'm more than likely to get a 4, but if I fail this check, then none of these cards go away and the location stays open, which makes the game a lot harder. So I'm going to go ahead and just play a blessing here to add an extra die to my check because, hey, I really want to make sure I close this. Now, I could play another blessing here from Kira to really make sure to close the location, but the odds of rolling 2d12 and not getting a 4 are pretty tiny, so I'm just going to take my chances. And it'd be hilarious if I failed. Okay, good, I didn't. So we successfully closed the bridge. All these cards go back in the box, and now the wooden bridge is closed. And that's pretty lucky that, I managed to find the henchman on the very first exploration. That the wooden bridge is a special effect here that when you end your turn here, you can bury a card from your hand to recharge a card from your discard pile. So if I wanted to, I could do that. Let's say I really wanted to get back a Blessing of the Gods or a Burglar. Sure, why not? Let's do this thing. So I'm going to bury these caltrops. And I'm going to get the blessing back into my deck. So that's just like a random little thing I could do just because. Okay, so I think actually with that, there's just one more thing that I want to explain, and then we're going to call it. I'm not going to play through the rest of the scenario because this was already, more than long enough, and I'm sure nobody actually wants to watch me play this. I will be doing an actual full-length gameplay playthrough series, so if you want to watch me play and be all strategic and stuff, keep your eyes peeled. That'll be coming up here shortly. But basically, I just want to explain what happens if you find the villain, but you haven't closed all the locations. Can you still win? The answer is yes. So we're going to just go ahead and, for the purpose of illustration, just skip Kira's turn. And I'm going to move Mauricio to the farmhouse. Okay, so right now I'm going to ask you to use your imagination, all right? I'm going to ask you to pretend that this waterfront here is closed, all right? I'm going to ask you to pretend that the only open locations now are the farmhouse where Mauricio is and the woods where Kira is. If Mauricio encounters a villain on her exploration, then Kira can actually do what's called temporarily close the woods. This happens before the combat check, so you have to decide before the character who found the villain it makes the check to defeat them. Um, and what basically Kira will do is she will try this check, this Wisdom or Survival 6 check, to close the woods. If she succeeds the check, then the woods are temporarily closed. Then Mariziel will continue with her check to defeat the villain, and if she succeeds, the villain will have nowhere to run. Because remember, we pretended that the waterfront is closed. The wooden bridge got closed on the first turn of the game because Mariziel got lucky and found the bandit henchman right on top. And Kira temporarily closed the woods. So since the villain has nowhere to run to, the game is over, and you win the scenario. Then you collect the rewards for the scenario, rebuild your decks, and live the good life. If instead we have this situation as it is on the screen where it's for real, then Kira can still close the woods temporarily, and if Mariziel defeats the villain does have one place to run. The villain will get shuffled into the waterfront here, and so now both players will know that the villain's in the waterfront. At this point, that's how it's possible to happen that there will be a henchman and a villain in the same location. So if you do find the bandit henchman early in the waterfront, and you successfully make the check to close the location, you'll inspect the rest of the waterfront, find that the villain is in there, and then clear out all the cards from the waterfront, put them all back in the box except for the villain. So what will be left at the waterfront is a single card that you know is the villain. So it's actually nice in this game if you can scout. If there are several effects that let you peek at the cards in the top cards of a location deck. If you can find the villain by scouting, then you can basically set up a situation where you corner the villain. You don't actually close all the locations in the game. You just temporarily close a few while one person beats up the villain. Then you can win without having to find all the henchmen and close everything. You might be wondering, well, Boris, why do I care about that? Why don't I just go through all the locations and close them all? It doesn't seem that hard. The answer is time. At the beginning of the game, you start with a deck of 30 blessing cards, and each turn, one blessing is discarded. This has a couple of significant effects. So first of all, the currently shown blessing, you can mimic its effect if you play a Blessing of the Gods. So for example, the currently shown blessing here is a Blessing of Aurora. That means that when anyone plays a Blessing of the Gods, they can either use the regular Blessing of the Gods power or the Blessing of Aurora power, which allows you to add 2 dice to any non-combat intelligence check. So if you're making an intelligence check and this happens to be the blessing that's showing on top, then any Blessing of the Gods that is played actually adds 2 dice instead of 1. The more significant effect, though, is that if there are no cards left in the blessing deck at the start of the turn, then the players run out of time and they lose. So that's actually, I didn't say this, but technically the very first thing you do at the beginning of your turn is discard the top card of the blessing deck. Let me just skip Mariziel's turn here and you'll see this. Go from 27 to a 26. So if you take too long, then you might run out of time. And that's why being able to corner the villain is a good time-saving measure. Time becomes more of an issue the more players that you have. In a 2-player game, there are 4 locations. In a 6-player game, there are 8 locations. In a 2-player game, there are 30 cards in the Blessings deck, so 30 turns for the players to win. In a 6-player game, there are 30 cards in the Blessings deck. No matter how many players you add, the number of turns you have to successfully win never increases. But each player that you add does give you an extra location to plow through. Now, of course, the more players there are, the more synergy there can be among the cards. But the total number of turns never increases. In a 2-player game, both players can make 15 turns. In a 6-player game, each of the players can only make 5 turns. So you don't have more time, you only have more total resources. And that's what can make the large player games quite challenging. So again, oftentimes in those games, you'll have to corner the villain by temporarily closing locations. In a 2-player game, yeah, you can just close all the locations one by one. There are a total of 40 cards in the game, and you have 30 turns. And as long as the henchmen aren't at the bottom of every single deck, you can just wade through each location and close them all as you go. So the strategy in the game does change significantly depending on your number of players. Okay, folks, there's a lot of things I haven't explained. I'm sure there's some minute, finicky rules that, will surprise you if you do buy the physical game. But I'm pretty sure that I've explained enough of this so that you get the general idea of how this game plays out, and you can, get a sense of whether you like the game or not. Well, just go ahead and make another turn here. Yeah, this is good. It's been actually kind of perfect here. So we found an item in the woods. This is not a monster and it's not a barrier, so it is a boon. And when you find a boon, it works very similarly to monsters. It'll tell you up in the right-hand corner what check to make. So here it's intelligence or craft. Kira doesn't have the craft skill, so she'll probably use her intelligence, which is a d6. And this is the number that you have to hit. If you successfully make the check, then you get to add the boon to your hand. If you fail the check, as I have here, then the boon is banished. It is put back into the box. However, if you fail a check against a monster or a barrier, the card does not go back in the box. The card goes back into the location deck, and it is shuffled, so you lose some time. Let me see if I can try to find a monster here. I know I said I'd explain one more thing, and I'm like keeping on going. Sorry. My video, my rules, bitches. Let's see if we can illustrate this. There we go. Perfect. So a mercenary. So Maurizio's like, oh, I'm going to punch the mercenary. All right, so she rolls her d8 strength, rolls a 1, and the mercenary hits her. So what happens now is you actually take damage equal to the difference between what you rolled and what the check was. The mercenary's check is a 10. Mercial rolled a 1. The difference there is 9, so you take 9 damage. The way that damage works is you have to discard cards equal to the damage. So I have to discard 9 cards to cancel out the damage. What's interesting, though, is this game is actually pretty nice. If you run out of cards and your hand is empty, but you still have damage left over, yep, you get off scot-free. You don't have to do anything. You don't lose any more. So like it's kind of like the less cards are in your hand, the safer you are. The Woods actually has a special ability. Undefeated monsters other than villains or henchmen are banished. So normally the mercenary would get shuffled back into this deck, but because we're in the woods, he's actually going to get banished. And Maurizio sort of beat him at a cost of 5 discarded cards. At the end of the turn, she draws back up to her hand size and only has 3 cards remaining in her deck. So that's pretty significant because if she, loses 4 more cards and has to draw, she'll die. If you have to draw and there are no cards in your deck, your character is dead. So she probably needs Kira the healer to heal her up here pretty soon. But that's a story for another day. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like and or subscribe to my channel if you did. And I'll see you again soon for some actual Pathfinder Adventures gameplay. Take care, everybody.